Within the galaxy, there exist countless numbers of races and civilizations, each of which displaying varying degrees of technological development. Some races have only recently mastered the art of creating fire, while others have taken their first steps towards interstellar expansion. Over time, however, many of these races will encounter one another, and more often than not, this inevitably leads to confrontation or even outright war. Some races will launch raids upon worlds that belong to another for the purpose of conquest, in order to claim resources for their ever-expanding empires. Others will go to war in an attempt to delay their inevitable extinction, to consume or destroy all in their path, or simply for the sheer joy that such conflict brings. Sometimes, however, these races can momentarily set aside their differences and form temporary truces and alliances in order to combat against a greater common threat. For the Imperium of Man, such alliances are typically seen as rare and unusual given the commonly held xenophobic attitude that is prevalent upon many human worlds. Despite humanity's overall hatred of alien races, there have been several documented accounts of Imperial forces allying with a multitude of Xenos types. The enigmatic Eldari of the Craft Worlds have been known to frequently lend their aid to the Imperium, so as to unite against their common foe in the forces of chaos. Even the violent hordes of the Orcs have engaged in temporary truces with the Imperium in order to focus upon the greater threat of the Tyranids. Such human-Xenos alliances are not recent developments within the Imperium, as a number have been attempted since at least the days of the Great Crusade. Eldrad Ulthran, the Farseer of the Eldari craft world of Ulthwé, attempted to forge alliances with at least 3 of the Primarchs, the genetically engineered sons of the Emperor of Mankind, to stand against the threat posed by the Ruinous Powers. However, Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands would ignore his pleas, and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children was unknowingly becoming corrupted by the demonic entity bound within the Silver Blade of Leia, a weapon that the Primarch took as a trophy. Vulcan of the Salamanders, however, would eventually heed the Farseer's words of warning during the later years of the Horus Heresy. But Eldrad was not the only Xenos figure of note to have reached out to one of the Primarchs around this time, for a far more ancient individual supposedly attempted to establish their own alliance. Jarek, greatest of the Silent Kings of the bygone Necrontyr Empire. When the Silent King revealed himself to the warriors of the Blood Angel Space Marine chapter upon the world of Gehenna Prime, the supreme ruler of the Necron race wore a golden death mask fashioned into the likeness of the Blood Angel's Primarch, Sanguinius. Unlike the similar mask worn by the Blood Angel's chapter master, Dante, which depicts Sanguinius at his most vengeful, the visage worn by Jarek depicts the Primarch at his most serene and peaceful, an appearance depicting Sanguinius as a benevolent and noble king. The reason that the Silent King wore this mask of Sanguinius is supposedly to honour the Primarch, a claim that would be supported by the Necron noble known as the Judicator Prime.
Mighty Zarek, last and greatest of the Silent Kings, honors your angel father and the accord that we wish to strike with him in ages past.
So why did the Silent King attempt to establish an alliance with Sanguinius? It would appear, at least from an initial standpoint, that the main reason behind Jarek proposing an alliance with Sanguinius would be to combat against the imminent threat of the Tyranids, which, during the years of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, had yet to appear within the Milky Way galaxy. It is well known that, unlike the majority of the Necron race, the Silent King chose not to partake in the Great Sleep, which saw the Necrons retreat and enter into a state of hibernation within their vast tomb complexes. Instead, Jarek chose to wander across the vast expanse of the universe, only returning to the Milky Way galaxy after encountering the hive fleets of the Tyrannid swarm within the void. Since the Tyrannids are arguably one of, if not the greatest threat to all life within the galaxy, then attempting to form an alliance of sentient races to stand united against such an all-devouring swarm would make a degree of logical sense. The story Word of the Silent King would also appear to support this very notion with the following passage.
If ever there were a human to be mourned, noble Skarak would say that it was him. That alliance, the first alliance perhaps, might have ended the threat of the Devourer before it ever surfaced. At least, the Tyranids might never have been drawn into this galaxy in the first instance. Like the humans, the Silent King was blind to this possibility at the time.
The main problem with this potential motivation, however, is twofold. Firstly, according to the 5th edition Necron Codex, the Silent King's return to the galaxy after his initial encounter with the Tyrannids did not take place until approximately 744 M41, long after the death of Sanguinius, which occurred during the final hours of the Horus Heresy. While it is admittedly possible that Jarek's High Chronomancer could have theoretically utilized his unique time-scrying abilities to witness potential events that could unfold within the future, this then leads into a second problem with this supposed proposal to Sanguinius. As stated with the previously mentioned passage from Word of the Silent King, Jarek was said to be blind to the possibility of ending the threat of the Great Devourer. This would suggest that, whatever the true rationale behind the Silent King's interest in forming an alliance with Sanguinius, nullifying the threat of the Tyrannids would have been merely a beneficial consequence of such an act. This would instead seem to imply that the Silent King wished to potentially lend his aid in combating against the powers of chaos, perhaps by lending his aid to loyalist forces during the course of the Horus Heresy. As mentioned earlier, a number of individuals from a variety of Xenos races would attempt to warn humanity of the danger posed by the ruinous powers during the later years of the Great Crusade. The organization known as the Cabal, for instance, would plead their case to the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion in order to attempt to save the galaxy from the corrupting powers of chaos at the cost of humanity's extinction, while Eldrad Ulthran, as stated previously, would attempt to warn several of the Primarchs of the danger that chaos posed to all life. Even in more recent times, certain Necron lords have been known to lend their aid to combat against the threat posed by the ruinous powers. When Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade, the Necron lord Trazyn the Infinite would ally with Imperial forces during the Siege of Cadia, and the Necron would unleash many specimens from his collection to bolster the ranks of the Imperium's defending armies. Trazyn would also provide assistance to the Archmagus Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Belisarius Call, with the activation of the Cadian pylons, in an attempt to turn back the tide of warp energies being unleashed during the course of the conflict. With this in mind, it's possible that the Silent King also learned of the Chaos Gods and their attempts to corrupt several of the Space Marine legions, and so in order to end such a potentially destructive conflict before it could grow out of control, sought out Sanguinius, who was quite possibly the single most respected and beloved of all the Primarchs, in order to warn humanity of the threat of the Dark Gods. Potentially, the Silent King could have even attempted to propose such an alliance in order to strike at the future traitor Primarchs prior to the events of the Istvan III purgings, or possibly even earlier, in an attempt to prevent the ruinous powers from gaining such powerful pawns within the material realm. If the Horus Heresy could have, in effect, been ended before it truly began, then as a side effect, the Battle of Sofa would have never taken place, which in turn would mean that the Pharos beacon would not have become overloaded, and as a result, the greater bulk of the Tyranid race would not have begun to make their way into the Milky Way galaxy, for there would have been no mass discharge of psychic energy on that scale to attract them. Indeed, the Necrons themselves would appear to believe that, should the events of the Horus Heresy have failed to occur, then the Imperium would not have fallen into a technologically stagnant and religiously paranoid state.
It is curious what the humans choose to know of their past, and what remains unremembered. They do not heed the lessons that they have already learned, because they often elect to forget them. Perhaps, had he not fallen to illogical and prideful infighting, their Sanguinius angel might have steered them towards a more enlightened destiny. Certainly, he would have made a more amenable emperor than the preserved witch corpse.
But ultimately, there could be a final fact that renders all these hypotheses null and void. That being, the Silent King may not have actually met Sanguinius, and simply claimed to have done so as a ploy to win the trust of the modern-day Blood Angels chapter. While the Judicator Prime claims that the Silent King is incapable of lying, this may not necessarily be true, and such claims may instead be little more than unsubstantiated propaganda used to convince lesser races of the majesty and glory of the Silent King himself. Ultimately, we may never know the truth behind the Silent King's actions. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.